Firstly, I just want to thank Lorinda for that talk. When I was an assistant curator at the Powerhouse Museum, I acquired some Waterhouse family material, including their bookie bags when they'd been warned off courses. And I was a curator of Phar Lap up at Museum Victoria, so it really kind of, I enjoyed it. But look, I'm here today to talk about, I've been asked to speak about art in a collection rather than historic items, which is actually sort of more my background with social history. Actually, I need to check. Where's the... thank you. Okay. By any standard, the City of Melbourne's Art and Heritage Collection is eclectic. Its most basic division is between its indoor and outdoor components. And you can see a couple of the outdoor components, Burke and Wills in the middle on the right, or Vault, also known as colloquially as the Yellow Peril, up on that top line. It also, basically 8,000 items have been catalogued. It also includes Lord Mayoral portraits, and they are sort of like the cornerstone of the indoor collection and take pride of place in the Melbourne Town Hall. Other key categories of the indoor collection include materials such as artefacts relating to the ceremonial and civil functions of council, gifts. You can see that banana again on the middle row from the Mayor of Coffs Harbour. Where are we now? Historic Melbourne, Moomba, the 1956 Olympic Games, and a contemporary art collection, which favours representation. Anyway, look, we'll get onto that in just a moment. Essentially, I think that with art components, they're quite different from historic artefacts in some respects. In some they're not. But really, I think that when an artist produces a work, they always say that like the work speaks for itself. And I think that's absolutely true. But I think that they also sort of gain a lot by actually getting into a collection. And I think my sort of general point there is that every part of a collection actually gives something to the other elements that are in there, that are in that collection, particularly if they have actually had some criteria to their acquisition. With the City of Melbourne's collection, at least some of the material just sort of has to be taken at face value. There was no such thing as a collection until about 20 years ago in terms of the way it's sort of conceived and described. The material was just sort of described as the valuable old stuff. And it had been like that for a long time. And then slowly from about the late 80s, it started to have applied to it a whole lot of sort of new museological principles. With those new museological principles came a whole lot of different sort of notions about criteria. And these were particularly important for contemporary art. The collection is not actually that rich in terms of art. Certainly it's got its Lord Mayoral portraits, but other than that, the pieces are very sort of haphazard, I suppose. So you've got these survivors, if you like, that have survived within council. And then apart from that, you've got certainly the historic artworks, but not much else. With the contemporary art component, that was very much, if you like, about sort of dealing with an absence in one respect. It was actually like at that point that the City of Melbourne decided that it actually wanted to do something about establishing an art collection. And so it put aside essentially between 30 and 50,000 a year, and started to get together a panel, which in turn developed criteria. And in sort of like in a general sense, you can see, you know, obvious things: strong artistic merit, strong display potential for council properties. I can't emphasise this point enough, that I always say that it's a working collection. We're different to a state collection. I have a state collection background, and the way things are justified, display comes into it with state collection items, but with our collection, if it can't sort of earn its keep in a display sense, it just sort of doesn't really have any right to be in the collection. Certainly not a new item. I'm not sort of talking about the historic items. And, okay, strong display potential, and in turn, from a conservation perspective, the artworks have to be strong enough to withstand long-term display. And then, place like any council, it's a very kind of political situation all the time. You can see there, artworks will contribute to and align with the future Melbourne plan. Now, I'm going to speak about the future Melbourne plan for 10 minutes. Only joking. I won't discuss it with you at all, other than to say the collection has to fit in to council's other plans, and you have to sort of justify yourself in those terms. Now, this very much goes for new art, and indeed justifying the entire collection. Okay, now specific criteria. You can see there, new acquisitions will have a connection to the inner Melbourne and or city life, urban landscape, social dynamics, multiple challenges that face cities in the 21st century. You know, you can read environment stuff there. Abstract modes of thought and sensory perceptions fueled by urban life. That's about non-representational sort of images of the city. Artworks by Australian Indigenous artists, urban Indigenous artists, they have an urban practice, and artworks that draw upon and give something back to other elements of the collection. The Indigenous component really is a lot about sort of dealing with an absence in the collection. And essentially there's nothing in the collection. Even though it goes back to the 1850s for some material, there's nothing in the collection that actually deals with, of a historic character, that deals with Indigenous Melbourne. And so to deal with that, there's been this sort of dedicated area, but not collecting dot paintings from Central Australia. It's very much about collecting artworks from urban Indigenous artists. This one here, this guy here, Trevor Nichols, he's regarded as sort of like the granddaddy of the urban Indigenous artist, born in Adelaide, 1949. Grew up in Port Adelaide, very much an Indigenous sort of, a suburb with a lot of Indigenous people in it, certainly historically. And you can see there, he's sort of, I counted here, there's 13 faces there. So he's very much dealing with a sense of the duality of growing up black in a non-Indigenous city environment. And we're altogether untroubled by the fact he comes from Adelaide. It's sort of like, this is sort of bigger stuff than Melbourne, Sydney, Adelaide. It's about the urban experience. Also with this work, he actually lived in a number of cities, including Melbourne. He was linked up with the Raw group of the 1980s. And, yeah. This is an image taken by the artist Brenda Croft's father, and then she sort of slightly reworked the image and reprinted it very large. You can see 80 by 119 centimetres. It was actually taken in 1958, and you can see the ICI building right up the end of Lonsdale Street there, and Lonsdale? Yeah, Lonsdale. And you can see her father is handling a parking meter. Now this image here, in terms of how to make images work, I think we've had this in 3 exhibitions at the City Gallery. One on the height of buildings, ICI House, one on parking and the City of Melbourne, and another one on the Indigenous art collection within the city itself. So, you know, it's really received a bit of a thrashing, to be honest. Again, this is by an artist called Clinton Nain, whose country is Torres Strait Islands. And you can see here he's got, the title is AEIOU. The background is, the black is bitumen, the white paint is house paint, and there's a sense of it relating to obviously being like a blackboard, and, you know, the use of language by the coloniser to deny Indigenous people their own language. The thing about Clinton that's interesting, all of this, his country is extremely important to him, and, you know, he's to some extent he's been, you know, in being removed from it, he's been denied that sort of aspect of the full knowledge of his past. He very much lives with that Torres Strait Islander element, but equally he was born here. And you know, for him, he's regaled me with stories of going to Moomba, for instance. You know, so it's, again, it's sort of the urban element is very important to him. It's almost like a bit of serious fun. You can see from Abbo Road instead of Abbey Road, George Paul, you know, Bush, Howard, etc. back in the days, and then Osama bin Laden. Although it doesn't actually say so in our criteria, we can't resist an image of a street. Okay, with other material, this is a really sort of obvious element for us to get involved in, social, cafe culture, and so on, by an artist who did a number of paintings on his walk from Richmond into the city every day. Louise Heerman, football, need I say more? This is by Gunter Christman, who is in his 70s and whose alter ego is called Oscar. And if you look closely, all of those squiggles are basically tags that he's developed. And we like this work because certainly it sort of relates to our environmental themes with the criteria, but it also relates to the street and tagging. And street art is an area that we've collected really, you know, quite sort of seriously, but in a way as sort of street documentation rather than necessarily always being art. We have collected an 8-panel piece by leading street artists that came from 2004. It was like the first piece that was shown, first major piece in a major exhibition by street artists, and that was from 2004. Here's an interesting work. Polly Borland, Melbourne girl, went to London, did very well over there as both an artist and a press photographer, and she got the gig in 2001 to take a series of photos over 5 minutes with Her Majesty. What's sort of interesting about this work is it relates very closely to our collection. As you'd expect, we've got a lot of royal material in the collection. Every local government collection ought to. And I like this work because it does bring a contemporary art sensibility to this social history element of the collection. And so this very much gets over the line with the criteria as an artwork, but it's got this fantastic relationship with the sort of social history, pictorial element of the collection. And I like it a lot, apart from simply enjoying it. I love the way that it actually attracts very strong reactions from people. Some people dislike it because they think it's too sort of literally in your face, or rather in her face. Other people sort of like it very much for, it's more got a sort of celebrity photograph sort of feel to it. And, the Queen she's a lot of things, but, she's become a celebrity. She doesn't even fight it these days, a la the James Bond incident with the Olympics. Documentary artistic, these photographs here sort of cover both the documentary and the artistic. Sue Ford's a photographer. She's got she died a couple of years ago, unfortunately, but she's got a show coming up at the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra later this year, I think. We acquired a number of photographs from her estate, and you can see there what that is that's sort of like the detritus from a Vietnam march from the early 1970s, town hall on the right, and so on. In terms of commissions sort of give the commissioner an opportunity to really have a very kind of strong hand on what it is that's coming into the collection. And if done well, they can add a lot to a collection. You have to be careful not to be to over-determine too much what you want the artist to do. In this case, Peter Atkins was asked to produce artworks that would fill a stairwell in the administration building of Town Hall, and to produce something that was very Melbourne. And he told me that he was actually pulling his hair out before one day at the State Library of Victoria. He started looking at the Melways collection going back to the 1950s. And I think they're easier to pick here when you see them all like this, but when you see them one at a time, people sort of have a lot of difficulty at first working out where they know them from. They sort of give them a sort of a warm inner glow, because you can see the words have been removed and they're actually paintings. So they're not printed, they've got a different kind of materiality to them. I'm going to flick over that one. And that one. This work here is by a photographer called Patrick Pound. And here he's worked with, every second image along there is actually from our collection. And they exist, these are the classic sort of things you have in a collection that are far too good to throw out, but equally you know remarkably little about them. You know nothing about the person who's been photographed. All you have a sense of is the studio from which they came. And what he's done here is he's worked with a line of them like that, and he's added much more recent images. And what he likes about the images that he's added is the way they're failures in a way as portrait photographs. You can see that none of them are actually looking at the camera. They're all sort of like they're all gone a little bit pear-shaped. I think as a group this hangs together well and actually manages to make something of which otherwise would not have worked. And I mean, this is the third element of our criteria. Oh, well, as I said, he's managed to... Well, I wouldn't say it is. To me, it's actually, well, clearly, I think that's the beauty of art. Different people can have different opinions. It's just like with the Queen. I'm sorry? Yes. Yeah, I think it can be based on more than that, but, it's interesting that it hasn't worked for you. This here is a couple of paintings by Stephen Bush of the Walter Lindrum billiard hall. That's going back to 1980. And then Kingsway down below, the rooftops. this sort of really, the bottom one, that sort of really marked a sort of sense of getting a different sort of view, perspective of a city, one that's much more about sort of earthy, not earthy, that's a poor use of word, but not about the grand, I suppose. It's the elements of cities that aren't sort of celebrated. And the top one, that's now a hotel. So this is an example of contemporary art that has got both, it can be read unto itself and enjoyed as that, but it's also got this fantastic documentary historical element to it as well. This is Tom Roberts' portrait. That's our best known Lord Mayoral portrait. And look, I won't lose a lot of time on that, but it's a magnificent piece of work, really is. And the Lord Mayoral portrait collection generally, as I said right at the beginning, it is the cornerstone of the collection. This here, it's a donation, and it's by the raw artist Sarah Faulkner. This is a sort of work where it's very important to have strong criteria, because without them you leave yourself exposed to sort of charges of my 6-year-old could do that. And it's important to have a sense of how the works that go into the collection actually fit into an art historical context, and preferably within that a Melbourne art historical context. And given that the raw movement is probably the most significant art movement within Melbourne, that's particular to Melbourne of the last few decades, was worth getting. Now, I mean, with this work in particular, I was nervous about hanging this in the council meeting room, the council committee room rather, but the councillors really enjoyed it. And, you can never tell, actually, how that sort of thing is going to go. That's it? That's the last slide. Okay. And indeed, we now have to, going back to the Lord Mayoral thing, we now have to think about getting a new Lord Mayoral portrait done for the current serving Lord Mayor, who, by the time he finishes, if he finishes, will have done 8 years, which will make him the longest serving Lord Mayor in history. Just sort of finally then, I think that in terms of the 2.0 significance document, I think that it's important to consider not just across collections and how significance matches up with items in other collections, but very much about how significance is gained within a collection. That simply you can sort of, an item on its own is a pretty sort of lonely piece. The other sort of area I think is they can gain a lot of sort of strength, if you like, through their relationship with community. And in terms of the 2.0 document, right towards the back of it, they talk about principles of good practice. I think that number 3, they talk about associations and comments on ruptures about when items move into a collection. I just want to make the point that they actually gain a lot when they enter a collection. And also there's comments about problems with collection material in terms of Indigenous communities and the material being sort of disassociated. I think that you can also take the example here of an Indigenous art collection which is actually gathered strength and is recognised by an Indigenous community as being a positive thing in itself. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Eddie. We were talking about significant statements, and I can see how significant statements can relatively easily be applied to historical objects. But when we're talking about contemporary art, I can see a whole range of problems in dealing with significance when so much of it, as we've sort of hinted at, seems to be based on opinion. And if these significant statements are going to mean anything in a long-term way, how do we get around this temporary nature of opinion?
Look, I think that the term opinion here is something which in itself is worth exploring. For instance, with the raw piece, if someone is to go, that was the work of the Southeastern Freeway being built, the one that I said I wasn't sure about how councillors would take it, and it turned out that they liked it. There, I was concerned about what the councillors thought of it in terms of their immediate opinion. In terms of an art historical, the art history discipline, that work actually has an established place, and no one who knows their art history would deny its place. And I think that for instance, with, just to take the Lord Mayor as an example, he knew about the raw group. He recognised that as being a raw work, and he appreciated it all the more for being a raw work. So, I've, in terms of history items, I've collected pit covers from the street, and some people look at them and go, why on earth would you collect something like this? It's a steel thing from the street. I don't get why you would want to collect that. And look, that's an opinion. But I mean, equally, I would argue that, for instance, that's the one that I showed right at the beginning. I won't bother with it, but it was one of the many, many items from the hydraulic company that was the predecessor to electrically powered lifts. And the hydraulics actually did that work. So there again, there's opinions and there's opinions, I think. Yeah. Hello.
I'm just a bit curious. In one way, it sort of leads on from what was being said, contemporary recording contemporary pieces, like with laneway art stuff that's going on now. And so, I mean, it's quite dynamic and it's quite significant at this point in time, and reflective of community and, what's going on with young people or old people or whatever. So I'm just curious about how you're going to go into recording that, and in 20 years' time.
I showed you a work by a guy called Gunter Christmann, the tag guy, and I actually did say that this worked in with other efforts that we've made to collect. We've actually collected quite a bit of material. I couldn't include the photos of it. That's the only reason why it's not there. And we've got, for instance, remember the City Lights efforts up in Hosier Lane? Up there, we collected 150 of the transparencies that went into the light boxes. I mentioned that we collected an 8-panel artwork that was actually from an indoor exhibition, but using the work of street artists. We also commissioned a report by Lachlan McDowell, who's the leading academic on street art in Melbourne, actually Australia, and he was paid to do this report, and part of that report was about selecting what he considered to be the 100 best examples of street art in Melbourne, and they were photographed as well, and we're looking there to do a sort of, if you like, a 7-Up style project to capture that.